looking at the various structures of the GI tract here, from mouth down to anus, and we'll talk about their functional aspect. So we're going to talk about the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, which are the upper components. We're going to talk about the stomach, which is that, storage area for food. We're going to talk about the small intestine, then the large intestine or the colon, and then the final part, which is the rectum and anus. Someone's asking, are all the layers the same throughout the entire tract? Which is an excellent question. Thank you so much for bringing that up. So no, they are not. The epithelia, the type of epithelia will change. So for example, in the stomach, we see columnar cells. In the other parts, so the intestine, small intestine, we're going to see stratified cells. So those cells are kind of stacked. Down towards the end of the tube, we're going to see some simple squamous, which are really even more flatter cells. So the type of epithelia will change. Also, the thickness of the muscularis externa will change. So when we get down into the colon, the muscularis externa is a bit thicker because the contents there are larger. The lumen there is larger. It's got more work to do in terms of moving that solidified waste. And so the muscularis externa, that thick, smooth muscle layer of the distal parts, are thicker, thinner in other areas, such as the esophagus and of the small intestine. The epithelial layers I mentioned will be different. And so there are different proportions, but all of the structures that we talked about are there, right? So there's always an epithelial layer, although the type of epithelia can change. There's always that muscularis externa, although the size of that will change as well. Okay, but that was a really great, excellent question. Okay, so let's kind of move on here, look at some of the functional connection to these structures. So starting with the mouth, this is where digestion begins. We start masticating our food by chewing it, breaking it down with our teeth, grinding, chewing, crushing, all that good stuff. We start releasing saliva. Saliva has several different roles. It's going to be a lubricant to start moving that food through the upper parts of the esophagus before we can get down to the stomach, where we release more of that fluid and that mucus. It's also going to have salivary amylase. And salivary amylase is an enzyme that begins the digestion of carbohydrates. So complex starch, glycogen, those can begin their digestive process actually in the mouth. This is why if you put a banana or a piece of bread in your mouth, you immediately start tasting it as sweet when that salivary amylase comes into contact and starts breaking down that more complex starch into glucose. Saliva also has another function, which is more of an immune function. So because of the enzymes that are found, the acidity of saliva as well, it's quite acidic. It's going to help to kill bacteria. It's going to help to kill viruses. Any type of pathogen that's coming into the mouth can start to be protected, we can start protecting the body against those with the acidity of the saliva as well. So there is that defense role, that immune role associated with saliva as well. Then we get down into the pharynx. This is the throat. Again, that shared opening with nasal cavity, oral cavity, and it's a common passageway for our air and our food. So it's really important to navigate food through this shared opening to prevent us from choking or from asphyxiating. And asphyxiation is where food goes into the larynx, which is no bueno, right? We don't want that at all. And so we have to make sure that we're not trying to breathe or speak. This is why you shouldn't speak and chew while we are swallowing, because food or the contents of the pharynx can only go in one direction. So while we're chewing, the epiglottis should cover over the larynx, and that bolus should move over the back of the epiglottis and enter the esophagus. Okay. All right, getting down into the esophagus, this is that long tube, that long connection from the pharynx down to the stomach. It's actually made of two different types of muscle. It's got an upper 1/3 made of skeletal muscle, meaning we can control that voluntarily, but it's got a lower 2/3 of smooth muscle, okay? This is where we can control things like swallowing or somewhat regurgitating food. If you ever feel like you're choking, you can kind of manipulate the upper 1/3 of the esophagus and try to manipulate that bolus out. But if it gets lower into the esophagus, there's no way that you can voluntarily manipulate that smooth muscle. right? There's also the upper esophageal sphincter, which is skeletal muscle, and that is kind of regulating the flow of food between the pharynx and the esophagus, whereas the lower esophageal sphincter is regulating the flow or the communication from the esophagus and down into the stomach. Okay, and these sphincters are just strips of smooth muscle. Again, we can voluntarily control the upper sphincter, right? If you've ever been gagging, you'll probably feel that sensation, whereas we cannot voluntarily control the lower esophageal sphincter. And then getting down into the stomach. So this is where we store food after it's been swallowed. The stomach can accommodate varying volumes. So it can go from 50 mL, which is an empty stomach, to about 1,000 mL, which is a full stomach. And the stomach can expand exponentially, right? So if you chronically overeat, your stomach will start to accommodate much more than 1,000 mL of food. That connective tissue, those layers that we just talked about, which are also forming the wall of the stomach, they will expand along with the rugae. So the rugae are these folds that are found throughout the stomach that increase the surface area. And so the stomach can expand physically to accommodate more volumes, but it can also grow exponentially if you are chronically requiring more volume. It's going to secrete gastric juice, which is mainly acidic, but also some other enzymes in there that help at the beginning, protein digestion and so on. And then we slowly release that food into the small intestine. So there is another sphincter at the end, or at the distal end of the stomach, which is the pyloric sphincter. It's found at the pylorus, which is that distal region of the stomach. And that will regulate the emptying of the stomach. So we don't just kind of flood food down into the intestine, right? We have to release it in a slow manner so that it has enough time to move through the intestine and allow for that more important absorption to happen. Okay, so essentially in the stomach, we're not seeing absorption just yet. We're just seeing the mixing, the mulching, the lubricating of the contents, and we start to see the beginning of digestion. We'll see absorption and more digestion in the distal parts. The stomach has a couple different parts, which you would have talked about in lab also. So it's got the top part here, the fundus. It's got the body, which is the main bulk of it, this J-shaped curved region. It's got the antrum, which is this other part down here. And the antrum is more of a physiologic distinction. So anatomists usually don't, appreciate the antrum. It's more to do with the physiology of the types of cells that are found here. And so it's not usually an anatomical description or of a part of the stomach. It's more of a physiological description. And then the very end being the pyloric sphincter, where the pylorus is found. So again, the function of the stomach is mixing of that chyme, where we have the contents being propelled and kind of mixed around with the acid that's being secreted. Then we see gastric emptying. There are certain structures in the stomach that help to accommodate its function. It's got the rugae, right? These folds that I mentioned before that give the internal layer this highly folded nature. And this allows for it to flatten out those folds and accommodate more volume. Okay, now also found within the stomach are these gastric pits. And these gastric pits are these deep invaginations that are seen throughout the stomach lining. So this is the mucosal layer of the stomach. This is kind of the lining of the stomach. And then we have this deep invagination that goes all the way down to the bottom here. That's called a gastric pit. And this makes up what's called a gastric gland. Now, there are several different cells that are found throughout these gastric pits or glands, and they are what help to secrete the contents into the stomach lining. So first of all, we've got chief cells, right? These are the first types of cells that we encounter. Chief cells secrete pepsinogen. And pepsinogen is the precursor, so it's that suffix gen, meaning that it's unactivated or inactivated. And pepsinogen is the precursor that eventually becomes pepsin. Now, pepsin is what's responsible for the initial digestion of proteins. okay? And so the precursor of that enzyme is what is secreted by the chief cells. Another type of cell that we have are the parietal cells. And the parietal cells secrete two different components here. So they secrete hydrogen ions, which are a major component of the acid. We'll talk about where that chloride comes from, but the hydrogen ion part comes from the parietal cells, and that creates hydrochloric acid, which is the acidity that we see with the stomach chyme. We also see intrinsic factor being secreted by the parietal cells. Intrinsic factor is necessary for the absorption of vitamin B12. This becomes really important in vegetarians and vegans. If they lack vitamin B12 in their diet, they usually have to have it supplemented. Intrinsic factor also becomes important for people who have had a stomach bypass. So if you had a gastric bypass, they usually try to maintain the top part of the stomach, and they usually cut all of this out. And again, this is usually seen in obese patients that have a really stretched, really enlarged stomach. And so the best thing to do is to eliminate that large volume to create more satiety with the diet. And so when they cut out the bulk of that stomach, we lose this intrinsic factor and we lose the ability to absorb B12. Okay. The next thing that we see here are the G cells, and the G cells secrete gastrin. Gastrin is going to be another hormone that we see along the GI tract. It's going to be what encourages gastric acid secretion. So when we have that stretching of the stomach, the G cells are stimulated to secrete this gastrin. That will be a signal for hydrochloric acid release, okay, that gastric acid release. And then finally, we have the neck cells, sometimes called the mucus neck cells. These secrete mucus along with bicarbonate, right? Bicarbonate is going to be really important for protecting the lining of the stomach from the acidity of that chyme. Okay, so just to run through this again, make sure we have this straight. We've got chief cells, which secrete pepsinogen. Pepsinogen becomes pepsin. Pepsin breaks down proteins. We've got parietal cells. They secrete hydrogen ions. That's a part of that acid. They also secrete an intrinsic factor, which is important for absorbing B12. We've got G cells that secrete gastrin, which is a hormone. And then we've got the neck cells that secrete mucus and bicarbonate. Now, in terms of just looking at our, in terms of just looking at our, at the gastric pit here, at these gastric glands, the cells that are at the bottom are not really easily differentiated from each other. So the parietal cells with the chief cells, with the G cells, they're all found at the bottom of this pit or this gastric gland. What we can differentiate are the neck cells, right? Because they're up towards the neck of the gland, right? They're up towards the more proximal area where they can easily secrete that mucus onto the lining of the stomach. So that acidity of the stomach environment is a pH of about 2, so very acidic as we can tell. It's necessary for activating pepsinogen. So again, that precursor that's coming out from those chief cells, needs to be activated to pepsin, and that happens under the influence of that acidity. The acid is also important for killing bacteria and forming or providing an immune role, a protective role of bacteria pathogens that are coming through, kind of just like saliva, as well as denaturing protein. So we can start that breakdown of protein because of that extreme acidity of that stomach content. Now there's a gastric mucosal barrier. This is a thin layer of protective substance that's on the stomach lining. It's made of mucus and bicarbonate that's coming from the neck cells, along with the goblet cells that are found as well. And the goblet cells are these unicellular glands. We would have talked about them in the respiratory system. They also can secrete mucus as well. So they will secrete that mucus along with bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is going to help to neutralize the acid when it comes really close to the stomach lining. And that is what essentially prevents us from digesting our own stomach, right? The separation of the contents of the stomach from the actual lining by this gastric mucosal barrier.